Hi guys, welcome again to our latest webinar on strength and conditioning for PER 2105 at ACPEs. Okay, this is a very brief video just to reacquaint you. Hopefully it's just to reacquaint you and it's not to teach you something you haven't heard before. But we're just going to briefly go over movement that occurs around the joints and how we refer to and express that movement. The next few webinars that will follow this webinar will be based upon the information in today. And it's when you're analysing and teaching various resistance training exercises in the gym. So we have a thorough understanding of what movement is occurring across the joints. Because if we know what movement's happening at the joints, that indicates to us what muscles are being activated. And quite often in gyms, if you've been in gyms, people have some amazing ideas of what muscles are active with exercises. Because simply we have to remember that movement occurs across a joint and the driving force of that movement is a muscle. So for a muscle to be involved in the movement, it has to cross that joint. Right. Now we've got a couple of very basic terms that we will use, and there's multitudes, and hopefully you've heard of these before. Specifically, we're talking about flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. We've also got horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. Also, occasionally you might see that referred to as horizontal flexion, horizontal extension. We also have rotation, internal, external, and circumduction, so big movements. We also have our scapula or our shoulder blades at the back, which form what's referred to as a shoulder girdle, and it can protract or re-elevate, depress, outward rotation, inward rotation. And quite often, because when we have movement, these joints are acting and they're moving in that path, and it's going to indicate to us. So we'll start with very basic extension and flexion. Now it occurs at probably a lot of joints. Now I'm going to have to stand up. As you can see, we're in a really great training facility here at ACPE. On. Something's happening. Is it happening? Is it turn camera on? There we go. Look at that. See, even old people can work out technology sometimes. Okay, boys and girls, here we go today. Apologise for my term. So we've got some really common terms that we use. I'm going to start with, of course, the most common exercise around, which is, or movement is, which is flexion and extension. Now, the easiest way to define or identify is if it's flexion, what we've got is the angle at the joint is closing. Now, if the angle of the joint is increasing, then generally refer to that as extension. Now, with the shoulder joint, if we have the arm moving forward, generally refer to that as flexion. When it goes down, we refer to that as extension. But it can also refer to extension. So going back in that motion. That's very simple. Now we can also have, I hope you can see, you get to see my old man legs. But with the knee, we can sit there and the knee again. If the angle between the joint is closing, then of course that's simply put as flexion, and if it extends through, it becomes extension, or if it lengthens. We've also got the hip joint. And so with the hip joint, if we're bringing up the femur, that of course, because the angle there is closing, we call that flexion. When we straighten the leg out, we're looking at the joint opening, which means it's extending. Now we do have the ankle. The ankle, again, it has flexion, but it does not have an extension term. Quite simply, we either dorsiflex or plantarflex our ankle. And the easiest way to remember this, of course, is that plantar flexion, if you're driving in your car and your foot's on the accelerator and you push your foot down, and we say we're planting it, so that's our plantar flexion. And so the angle's like that, plantar flexion. And with the foot, if it pulled towards closing that angle between what would be the shin and the foot. We call that dorsiflexion. So just think if the top of the foot raises up, then that's dorsiflexion. Now, once we've identified the movement that's occurring, and that's with our flexion extension. So I'll go back. Now, the other main ones we're going to refer to are abduction, adduction. Predominantly, especially with the upper body around the shoulder joints, is that simply put, that when we are adducting, which is ADD, we are starting here and coming towards the body. So the arm is moving, or the limb is moving towards the midline of the body. Now, if we're abducting, which is taking it away, which is abducting, it is the opposing movement. So, of course, it is taking away. Then when we have our horizontal abduction and adduction, so horizontal adduction is it comes across the body, abduction is going away. So again, you may see it occasionally referred to as horizontal flexion or horizontal extension. Not so common, but you may come across that term every now and then. So as long as you understand the movement is closing down. Now, when it comes to which muscles are active, we need to sit there and think which muscle is acting and pulling the movement on. And the easiest way to identify is look at the muscle that's actually shortening. So when we do the lift, if the muscle shortens and that generates the force that brings the movement across, then the muscle that's shortening is performing the action. So or is generating the power that pulls the limb or the bone across. Muscles pull on bones to create movement, they don't actually push. Now, when the muscle shortens, which leads to the angles closing or extending and lifting of the weight, we call that the concentric contraction. So think muscle shortens, force is generated, movement occurs, that is concentric contraction. And so the muscle that shortens whilst generating the force is our concentric muscle and the driving force of the movement. Now, an eccentric contraction is when we are opening up the joint is moving or releasing from the movement or returning to the start position, and the muscle is lengthening whilst it also maintains force. So we have to think of it as a braking force, really, generally. So if you were to imagine that when you do a bench press or a shoulder press as such, when we push up, you'll see that we're doing abduction. If we follow the line between the humerus and the trunk of the body, is we can see that that's actually abduction. So, and if we feel, you'll feel that your deltoids, in particular anterior and your middle delt, will actually be shortening as it lifts. Now, when we lower it back down or lowering of the weight, it's an eccentric contraction. Now, the thing we need to understand is the muscle that does the lifting controls on the lowering phase. The easiest way is if we use the deltoids to do the lifting, and then we were to apply shoulder joint adduction with that muscle, in that case being the latissimus dorsi, if that was to contract and pull down, then we'd have the fact of the dumbbells driving through our body and probably breaking something, or ending up on the floor and probably hitting your spotter on the foot, breaking that foot. So when we lift the weight, we're driving force, and the contraction is the muscle is shortening, delivering the force and lifting it. When we lower the weight, that same muscle that lifted the weight controls the lowering with the resistance generated against gravity, hence why we call it resistance training. So simply put, that we have the deltoids, anterior delt, mid delt, doing the lifting, it's driving the weight above against gravity, the muscle is shortening. And this would be shoulder joint abduction as it's moving away from the midline of the body. Then once we finish with that and we go back to conclude the rep, we are lowering it, but it's not the muscles underneath that are the driving force or the controlling force. It's still our anterior midline delt, middle delt, that are controlling or lowering it under resistance. Now, you also probably notice that when we do that action, that there's something still happening at the joint. And this is what we commonly refer to as a compound movement. In other words, we've got two joints moving in the action, similar to a squat, a bench press, a row action, a lat pull down, chin ups, any of those sorts of things. So it's that sort of concept that we're referring to. So our driving muscle, or the main prime mover, is the larger muscle group, which in this instance would be our anterior delts and middle delts doing the lifting. But then once we begin to get to the upper echelons of the movement, we notice that the elbow joint is starting to extend through. And here, the muscles that would extend are the ones that are shortening, which would be the triceps brachii, or the triceps in the back of the arm, those tuck-shop lady arms. So we press that up. So we've actually got more than one muscle group. So the anterior deltoid, prime mover, and it's been assisted with at the elbow joint with extension with the triceps brachii. Simply put, and we're going to have that in a lot of movement, especially these days that drift towards functional, that we're less likely to isolated movements. An isolated movement is where we have one joint. So for the shoulder, a common one is our lateral raises or our forward raises. So we're stabilizing the arm, there's no movement across the elbow, and we're just raising it up and lowering it. So that would be an isolated exercise for the deltoids. So again, we've got the tricep. As we go into extension, it's a concentric lift, lifting the weight against gravity or against the resistance to fully straighten, or well, not quite fully lock out, but in an extended position. Then as we lower it, the elbow joint begins to flex. But again, in flexing, it's not the bicep that is the driving force. It is still the tricep that is controlling the movement and lowering it under braking. A braking force has been applied to stop it from just plummeting down. And that's pretty much every movement. Now, when we go onto the webinars, and which are going to come up on a number of different exercises, these are going to include things from bench press to lat pull down to seated row to chin ups, back squats, front squats, deadlifts, shoulder press, lateral raises, that sort of thing. We need to think of it as what joints are moving, what movement are they doing, and therefore which muscle is shortening to be the prime mover and the assisting muscles. Now, of course, muscles never act by themselves. Even if we do have the chest muscle doing the primary movement in a chest press, which is, of course, horizontal adduction, we have an opposing muscle group, and that's the antagonist. So our correct terms would be the agonist, which is the moving, or the concentric contraction, and then opposing that is our antagonist muscles. So they work in about, and that's to do with our safety mechanisms and controlling. One of the reasons is that while we need to have a balanced program, if we do too much of the pushing and not much of the pulling, we get this strong, tight muscles and not so strong muscles at the back, and they're unable to resist the forces generated through our, what would this case be, the pectoralis major. And then we can lead to all sorts of troubles. And if anyone's seen anyone, they put the bench down, they start doing this, and they get all this pain here and pain there, and commonly referred to as rotator cuff injury. One of the most popular in the gym. Or, well, maybe not popular is not the correct term, but the most common injury. Okay, so that's what we need you to do is when we start analysing the exercises and when you start giving you technical direction, you're going to have to be able to explain the movements that are happening at the joints whilst we do the exercise, which will then generate which muscles are being employed. And then we're going to start looking at technical faults and technical corrections and how to set up and that sort of thing to eliminate that. So remember, because when it comes to your assessment for the ASCA Level 1 lifts, we are primarily looking at your ability to teach the lifts, not for yourself to do them, but for your ability to teach them. So remember that we've got our main ones: abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, and horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, internal, external rotation, circumduction, and then with our shoulder girdle where we have such wonderful terms as protraction, retraction, elevation, depression, external rotation, internal rotation, and all dependent on the movements that are going to occur. And so when we look to work our muscles, we're looking at which muscle activates or controls which movement. All right, guys, that's all for this one. It's short and sweet. Hopefully it will help. If you haven't looked at this for a while, if you haven't ever looked at this and it's all Latin to you, well, drop me an email and I'll get in contact with you via phone and we'll have a chat about it to get you through an understanding of flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and movements of joints and which muscles are controlling. All right, until our next webinar, thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you online.